Part 1. The Lone Man and the Parched Land. The sun, a merciless sovereign, reigned over a kingdom of rust-colored dust and cracked earth. In the year of our Lord 1885, the land around Dry Creek, Texas, had forgotten the taste of rain. It was a place where life clung on by a thread, and hope was a currency scarcer than water. The wind, a constant, restless spirit, carried the grit of the plains, scouring the paint from buildings and the patience from men. Law was a distant notion, a rumor from the east. Here, justice was more often measured in the weight of a colt peacemaker than in the words of a judge. North of the beleaguered town, on a patch of land that defied the definition of a ranch, lived Eli Rollins. He was a man etched by the sun and silence. His face, a landscape of fine lines, told the story of 40-odd years lived under an open sky. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held a quiet watchfulness, the kind that comes from spending more time with cattle and horizons than with people. 5 years had passed since he'd buried Martha, taken by a fever that burned through her as swiftly as a prairie fire. Since then, his world had shrunk to the boundaries of his failing property, his only companions the mournful lowing of his few remaining longhorns and the ceaseless whisper of the wind through the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods. His solitude was a physical thing, a second shadow that followed him from the dusty yard to the stark interior of his cabin. It sat with him at the rough-hewn table, a silent partner to his meager meals. It was a quiet ache, a familiar emptiness he no longer fought against. He had accepted it, the way he accepted the drought and the heat as an unchangeable fact of his existence. This morning, the ache was sharpened by a more pressing need. The last of the barley was gone, scraped from the bottom of the sack to feed his horse, Ajax, and himself. The animal's ribs were beginning to show, a stark reminder of their shared hardship. There was no choice. He had to ride into town. Eli cinched the saddle onto Ajax's back, his movements economical and practiced. He hated Dry Creek. It was a place of noise, of staring eyes and loose tongues. It was a place that reminded him of what he had lost, of the small kindnesses and community he and Martha had once tried to build before she was gone, and he had retreated into himself. He preferred the honesty of the parched earth, which promised nothing and delivered just that. But a man had to eat, and so did his horse. "Just for grain, old boy," he murmured, stroking Ajax's neck. "In and out." The ride was a journey through a dying world. The creek that gave the town its name was a ghostly ribbon of pale, cracked mud. The carcasses of cattle, picked clean by vultures, lay like bleached monuments to the relentless drought. Dust devils danced in the distance, swirling columns of red earth that rose to meet the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, making the air shimmer and dance. Dry Creek emerged from the haze not as an oasis, but as an extension of the desolation. Its single street was a wide gash of rutted dirt, lined with unpainted, sun-warped buildings. A few horses stood hitched to rails, heads hanging low in the oppressive heat, flicking their tails at flies with a weary lethargy. The usual hum of a town was absent. In its place was a tense, brittle quiet, as if the whole population were holding its breath, waiting for a storm that would never come. Eli dismounted in front of Croft's General Store, the largest and best-stocked establishment in town. He tied Ajax to the rail, giving the horse a final pat. The boardwalk groaned under his boots as he stepped up, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Pushing open the door, he was met with a wave of cooler air, thick with the scents of ground coffee, cured leather, and dust. The store was a cavern of shadows and goods, shelves stacked to the ceiling with everything a person might need to survive out here. Silas Croft, the proprietor, stood behind the counter, a man as thin and dry as a corn husk, polishing a glass jar with a rag. A few other townspeople were present, 2 women, Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Pritchard. their faces pinched with piety and disapproval, were examining bolts of calico. A ranch hand Eli vaguely recognized was weighing out nails. And then he saw her. She stood near the back, by the sacks of flour and sugar, a small figure cloaked in a plain, faded dress. A little girl, no older than 6, clung to her skirt, her face half hidden in the fabric. Eli recognized the woman from a distance, Miriam Harper, the town's resident pariah. Her husband, a mean-spirited drunkard named Jeb, had died a year ago. The doctor called it a stomach ailment, but the town had written its own, more sinister diagnosis. Whispers followed her like a miasma, ugly and persistent. They said she'd grown tired of Jeb's heavy hand and had found a permanent solution in the garden with a foxglove that grew wild by the creek bed. No proof was ever offered. None was needed. In a place like Dry Creek, suspicion was as good as a conviction. Eli watched as Miriam approached the counter, the child still attached to her side. Her movements were hesitant, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. She placed a small, nearly empty cloth pouch on the worn wood. "Silas," she began, her voice low but clear. "I need a sack of flour and some salt. I can pay you half now, the rest at the end of the month. I'll have work mending for the preacher's wife by then." Silas Croft stopped polishing the jar. He looked at the meager offering of coins, then at Miriam's face. A slow, contemptuous smile spread across his thin lips. "Credit," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet store. "Credit is for folks in good standing. Mrs. Harper. Folks I can trust." The two women by the calico stopped their pretense of shopping. They turned, their eyes sharp and gleaming with malice. The ranch hand paused his counting of nails. The air in the store grew thick and heavy. Miriam's chin lifted a fraction. "My husband and I always paid our debts here." "Your husband is dead," Croft shot back, the implication hanging venomously in the air. "And folks have their own ideas about how that came to be." A flush crept up Miriam's neck, a tide of shame and anger. "That's a lie, a wicked lie." "Is it, Mrs.?" Gable chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Poor Jeb, such a strong man, to be brought down so low." "She has the devil's eye, that one." "Mrs." Pritchard whispered to her companion, just loud enough for the whole store to hear. Miriam stood frozen, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's head. The little girl, sensing the hostility, pressed closer, her small body trembling. Miriam's gaze swept the room, meeting only hard, accusatory stares. She was utterly alone, an island in a sea of contempt. She looked less like a murderer and more like a cornered animal, her pride the only weapon she had left. Eli had seen men face down stampedes with less fear and more support than this woman was being shown. He had come to town for grain. That was all. He had no business here. Getting involved was a fool's errand. It would mean drawing the town's poison onto himself. He had enough trouble without borrowing more. He should just get his barley and leave. He took a step toward the sacks of grain, telling himself to mind his own. But then he saw the little girl. She peered out from behind her mother's skirt, her eyes wide and dark with a fear no child should know. And in that moment, something in Eli's carefully constructed wall of indifference cracked. He thought of Martha, of her kindness, of how she would have stood against this casual cruelty. He thought of the lonely years stretching before him, and the hollow echo in his own soul. His feet, seemingly of their own accord, moved toward the counter. He stopped beside Miriam Harper, his presence solid and unexpected. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on Silas Croft. The whispers in the store died instantly. Every eye was now on him. "The lady needs a 20-pound sack of flour," Eli said, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. "And a bag of salt. And while you're at it, get me 3 sacks of barley." Croft's eyes narrowed. "She ain't got the money, Rollins." Eli reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his worn leather purse. He untied the drawstring and dropped a heavy silver dollar onto the counter. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "I do," he said simply. He then looked down at the little girl. "And add a licorice stick to that." Miriam Harper turned to look at him, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, were filled with a mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and fierce, wounded pride. She opened her mouth to speak, to refuse, but no words came out. I can't accept," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. Eli met her gaze for the first time. He saw the rumors and the hardship and the loneliness warring in her expression. He saw resilience that bent but had not yet broken. "Ain't a gift," he said gruffly, turning his attention back to Croft, who was now sullenly bagging the flour. "Consider it a loan. Pay me back when you can." He didn't know why he said it, but the words felt right. It gave her back a piece of the dignity the town was so eager to strip away. He paid for everything, his own barley included. The transaction was completed in a tense silence. The other customers watched, their faces a mixture of shock and disapproval. Eli Rollins, the recluse, had just publicly sided with the town witch. He hefted a sack of barley onto his shoulder and carried it out, then came back for the other two. When he returned the last time, Miriam's flour and salt were waiting on the counter. She stood beside them, clutching the small paper bag that held the licorice stick. Her daughter was holding her other hand, no longer hiding. Eli nodded once at Miriam, a gesture that was neither friendly nor unkind, simply an acknowledgement. He tipped his hat slightly. "Ma'am." He walked out of the store and into the blinding sunlight, leaving her standing in the sudden, charged silence. He loaded the barley onto Ajax, his movement swift and efficient. He wanted to be gone. He wanted the quiet and the solitude of his own land. He wanted to forget the look in that woman's eyes. As he mounted his horse, he saw her emerge from the store, balancing the sack of flour on her hip, her daughter trailing behind. She stopped on the boardwalk and looked at him across the dusty street. For a long moment, their eyes met again. He saw a flicker of something he couldn't name, not just thanks, but a profound, aching vulnerability that resonated with his own. He broke the gaze first, turning Ajax toward the North Road. He did not look back. The ride home was long. The sacks of grain were a heavy, solid weight behind him, a confirmation of his purpose. Yet his mind was not on the barley. It was on the stifling quiet of the general store, the venom in the whispers, and the defiant lift of a young widow's chin. It was on the trusting grip of a little girl's hand on her mother's skirt. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The wind picked up, a cool breath against his weathered skin. He rode into the vast, empty landscape that was his home. He rode into town for grain. He told himself, the words a simple, solid fact. But as the miles unspooled behind him, the image of Miriam Harper's haunted green eyes and the silent, watchful face of her child refused to fade. They were now a part of his solitude, an unwelcome and unsettling presence in the quiet emptiness of his world. He had gotten his grain, yes, but he felt he was leaving with something more. Something heavier and far more complicated than 3 sacks of barley. Part 2. A small flame in the desert. For 3 days, the silence of Eli's ranch was different. It was no longer a hollow, familiar emptiness, but a space filled with the echo of a scene he couldn't shake. The memory of Miriam Harper's face, the defiance in her green eyes, the shame that colored her neck played over and over in his mind. He saw the small, dark-haired child, Sarah, peering from the safety of her mother's skirt, her gaze old with a fear that settled in his gut like a stone. He'd gone for grain and had returned with ghosts. He tried to work. He mended a stretch of fence, reshod Ajax, and sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. But there was no peace. The wind seemed to whisper the town's ugly words. and the cracked earth reminded him of the desolation he'd seen in the widow's eyes. He was a man accustomed to fixing things that were broken: a split rail, a worn-out harness, a leaking roof. The injustice he'd witnessed was a different kind of brokenness, one he couldn't easily mend with his hands, yet the impulse to try was a stubborn burr under his skin. On the morning of the fourth day, he gave in. In the cool darkness of his storeroom, he found a small burlap sack. He filled it with a mix of hardy seeds he'd been saving: squash, beans, and drought-resistant corn. They were precious, a hedge against a future that looked increasingly bleak. But the image of that barren yard and that hungry child was more potent than his own fear of starvation. He told himself it was just practical. No one should starve if another had a surplus, no matter how small. It was a simple code of the plains, one that the people of Dry Creek seemed to have forgotten. Saddling Ajax, he tied the sack of seeds behind the cantle. His excuse was flimsy. He knew, just some extra I had in the stores. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. He was riding toward trouble, and he knew it. But the alternative, sitting alone and doing nothing, felt worse. It felt like a betrayal of Martha's memory, and of some part of himself he thought had long since withered away. He didn't ride into town this time, but skirted it, following a faint track that led toward the patch of land the Harpers called home. The property was even more dilapidated up close than he had imagined. It was a testament to a slow, grinding defeat. The house, little more than a shack, listed to one side as if weary of its own weight. Its windows were dark, vacant eyes. The fence was a line of broken teeth, with entire sections missing. But it was the garden that struck him hardest. It was a plot of dead, gray stalks and sun-baked earth, crisscrossed with cracks wide enough to lose a coin in. It was a garden of ghosts, a place where hope had been planted and had died a thirsty death. A small figure was sitting on the warped steps of the porch. It was the little girl, Sarah. She wasn't playing, just sitting perfectly still, a worn-out corn-husk doll held loosely in her lap. As Eli drew closer, her head came up. She didn't run or cry out. She simply watched him, her dark eyes unblinking and solemn, her face a miniature mask of her mother's wary pride. Eli swung down from Ajax, the saddle leather creaking in the silence. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way one would approach a skittish foal. "Afternoon," he said, his voice quiet. The girl didn't answer. She just continued to stare, her small hands tightening on the doll. The front door of the cabin creaked open. Miriam Harper stepped out, wiping her hands on a threadbare apron. When she saw him, her body went rigid. Her eyes, which had haunted him for 3 days, were now sharp with alarm and suspicion. Her hand disappeared for a second inside the doorway and re-emerged holding a long, wicked-looking kitchen knife. She held it low, by her side, but the message was unmistakable. "What do you want, Mr. Rollins?" she asked, her voice tight and devoid of warmth. She positioned herself slightly in front of her daughter, a shield against his intrusion. "Ma'am," Eli said, nodding. He stopped a respectful distance away, keeping his hands in plain sight. "I was cleaning out my storeroom. Found I had a surplus of seeds, with the ground this hard. Figured they'd go to waste if someone didn't use them. Thought of you." He gestured with his head toward the sack on his horse. Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for a trick, for the true meaning behind the words. Charity was a weapon in Dry Creek, used to indebt and humiliate. "We don't need charity," she said, the words clipped and sharp. "I owe you for the flour. I'll pay you every cent." "I told you it was a loan," Eli replied evenly. "And this isn't charity. It's just neighborly. Seeds are meant for the ground, not a dark shelf." He saw the conflict in her face, the desperation for any small kindness, warring with the pride that had been her only defense for so long. She glanced at the dead garden, a flicker of pain in her eyes, then back at him. "Why?" she asked. the single word carrying the weight of a year of suspicion. "Why would you help me? The whole town thinks—" She cut herself off, but the unspoken accusation hung in the hot, still air. "I don't put much stock in what the town thinks," Eli said simply. "I saw a woman and her child who needed flour. Today, I see a garden that needs seeds. It's as simple as that." He paused. "My wife, Martha, she always said a person's got a duty to plant something. Didn't matter how hard the ground was." The mention of his wife seemed to soften something in her posture. The hand holding the knife relaxed, just slightly. She knew of Martha Rollins, as everyone did. A kind, quiet woman who had succumbed to the harshness of this land. "Your wife was a good woman," Miriam said, her voice softening a fraction. "Yes, she was," Eli agreed. He untied the sack of seeds and walked slowly forward, setting it on the ground well away from her. "They're yours if you want them. If not, the birds'll get 'em." He turned to leave, expecting that to be the end of it. He had done what he came to do. "Wait," she called out. He stopped and turned back. She was still standing on the porch, the knife still in her hand, but her expression had changed. The hard shell of her pride had cracked, revealing the exhaustion beneath. I don't know how. Jeb, he never had a mind for it, and the well is nearly dry." Eli looked at the dead garden, then at the sky, a vast, empty bowl of blue. "You don't need a flood to grow things," he said. "Just need to be smart about it." An unspoken agreement passed between them. Miriam slowly lowered the knife and finally set it on the porch railing. She walked down the steps, her daughter trailing cautiously behind her. The next few hours unfolded in a rhythm of shared, silent labor. Eli took a broken-handled spade he found leaning against the shack and began to turn the unforgiving soil. It was like digging into rock, but he worked with a steady, patient strength, his shoulders straining against the effort. After watching for a few minutes, Miriam retrieved a small hand trowel and began to work alongside him, breaking up the larger clods of earth he unearthed. They didn't speak much. The work was its own language. He showed her how to dig the furrows, not in straight lines, but following the contour of the slight slope, to catch any moisture that might fall. He demonstrated how to create small, sunken depressions around where each seed would go, a trick to gather the morning dew. His large, calloused hands moved with a surprising gentleness as he pressed the first few corn seeds into the thirsty ground. Miriam was a quick study. She mimicked his movements, her expression intent and focused. The sun beat down on them, and sweat traced paths through the dust on their skin. Sarah sat on the steps, watching them. The corn-husk doll held tight. For the first time, her expression was not of fear, but of a deep, childish curiosity. As Eli worked, he subtly took in the state of the place. He noticed the frayed rope on the well bucket, the way the cabin door hung crooked on its leather hinges, the desperate thinness of the lone chicken scratching in the dirt. This wasn't just poverty. It was a life hanging by a single, fraying thread. "The water," Miriam said, her voice raspy from the dust. "There's barely enough to drink." Eli walked over to the well and peered down. It was deep, and the water was dangerously low. "We'll use what we have," he said. He rigged the bucket to bring up just a little at a time, and they carefully rationed it, pouring a scant cupful into each depression where a seed lay waiting. It felt like a prayer, a desperate offering to an unforgiving God. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, they finished the last row, the small patch of turned earth, dotted with the promise of life. Looked like a scar of hope on the barren land. Eli stood up, stretching his back. Miriam remained kneeling, her hand resting on the soil as if she could feel the life stirring beneath. A strange sense of peace had settled between them, the kind that comes from hard, honest work done side by side. It was then that Sarah left the safety of the porch. She walked slowly over to where Eli stood, stopping just before him. She looked up at his tall, dusty figure, her head tilted. He was a giant of a man, weathered and grim, who had appeared out of nowhere. He had a quiet voice and kind hands. She had seen the way the townsfolk treated her mother, the way men's voices grew hard and cruel. This man was different. "Are you a good man or a bad man?" she asked. The question, in its stark, childish simplicity, struck Eli with more force than a physical blow. It was the question the whole world seemed to ask out here, where survival often required a man to be both. He looked down at the serious little face, and for the first time in years, he had no ready answer. Bad men had hurt this child's world. Good men had stood by and done nothing. What was he? He crouched down slowly, bringing himself to her level. His knees cracked in protest. "I'm just a man, little one," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Trying to do the right thing when I see it. Sometimes I get it right, sometimes I don't." Sarah seemed to consider his answer with the gravity of a seasoned judge. She gave a small, single nod, as if his words made a sort of sense to her. A sudden gust of wind swept through the yard, kicking up a swirl of red dust. It carried a different scent, with it the smell of ozone and damp earth. Eli looked up at the sky. The western horizon, which had been clear moments before, was now bruised with dark, heavy clouds. They were moving in fast, a menacing purple and gray army assembling for battle. The air grew thick and heavy, and a low, distant rumble echoed across the plains. Miriam rose to her feet, her hands shielding her eyes as she stared at the approaching storm. In a land starved for water, rain was a blessing, but a storm like the one brewing on the horizon was a different beast entirely. It was a force of raw, untamed power, capable of giving life and taking it away with equal indifference. The first fat drop of rain struck the dust at Eli's feet, leaving a dark spot the size of a silver dollar. Then another, and another. A low moan of wind whistled through the broken fence. The coming storm was a promise and a threat, and as the sky cracked open with the first flash of lightning, Eli knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was more than just a change in the weather. It was the world shifting on its axis. Part 3. The Tempest of the Heart. The storm did not arrive gently. It descended upon the plains with the fury of a vengeful god, a maelstrom of wind and water that seemed intent on scouring the land clean. Eli had only made it a mile from the Harper homestead when the heavens opened. The rain came not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that blurred the world into a gray, roaring chaos. Ajax, his sturdy horse, fought for footing on the instantly treacherous ground, which was turning from baked clay into a slick, sucking mud. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that vibrated through Eli's bones, and lightning bleached the landscape in stark, terrifying flashes. There was no question of making it back to his own ranch. He was closer to the Harper place, and even that felt a world away. He turned Ajax around, pulling his hat low and leaning into the wind, his shoulders hunched against the deluge. He had a sudden, gut-wrenching image of that listing shack, of the tired wood and the dark windows. It was a flimsy thing, built to withstand the sun. Not a tempest like this. He spurred Ajax on, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. The thought of Miriam and Sarah, alone in that fragile structure, was a more powerful motivator than the storm lashing at his back. When he finally saw the faint, flickering light of their lamp through the downpour, it was a beacon in a world gone mad. He reached the dubious shelter of a leaning shed near the main cabin just as a gust of wind, shrieking like a banshee, tore a loose shutter from the house and sent it cartwheeling into the darkness. He slid from Ajax's back, his boots sinking into the mud, and tethered the frightened animal as best he could inside the three-walled structure. Then, pulling his collar up, He ran, head down, toward the house. He hammered on the crooked door, his fist making a dull thud against the wet wood. "Mrs. Harper Miriam," he yelled, his voice nearly swallowed by the roar of the storm. The door was wrenched open from the inside. Miriam stood there, her face pale as bone in the flickering lamplight. Sarah was clinging to her leg, crying silently, her small face buried in her mother's dress. Water was already pooling on the floorboards, dripping from a dozen places in the ceiling. "You came back," Miriam shouted over the din, her expression a mixture of terror and disbelief. "This is no ordinary storm," Eli yelled back, stepping inside and shutting the door against the gale. "The roof won't hold. We need to get to the barn." As if to punctuate his words, a loud crack echoed from above, followed by the sound of splintering wood. A section of the ceiling in the far corner sagged dangerously, and a torrent of muddy water cascaded onto a small table below. Smashing a ceramic pitcher to pieces, Sarah screamed, a raw cry of pure terror. There was no time for argument. Eli didn't wait for Miriam's permission. He scooped the terrified child into his arms, wrapping her in the relative dryness of his duster. "Grab the lamp and a blanket," he commanded. "Now." Miriam, galvanized by the immediate danger, snatched a worn quilt from a nearby cot and the oil lamp from the table. The small flame danced wildly, casting frantic shadows on the walls, with Sarah held tight against his chest, her small arms locked around his neck. Eli pushed the door back open. Miriam followed close behind, shielding the lamp with her body. The journey to the barn, no more than 30 yards, was a desperate battle against the elements. The wind tore at them, trying to rip Sarah from his grasp and extinguish their small light. The mud sucked at their boots, threatening to pull them down. Lightning illuminated the scene in hellish flashes. The world was a blur of driving rain, flying debris, and churning mud. It was a primal, terrifying landscape. They stumbled through the barn's wide entrance and slammed the heavy doors shut, plunging themselves into a sudden, relative quiet. The roar of the storm was muffled now, a wild beast raging outside their wooden sanctuary. The only light was the fragile flame of the lamp in Miriam's trembling hands. The barn was small and smelled of dry hay, animal sweat, and damp earth. A single, bony milk cow looked at them with wide, placid eyes from its stall. Just as Miriam set the lamp down on a crate, a sound like the world tearing apart ripped through the night, a deafening groan of tortured wood, followed by a cataclysmic crash. Even over the storm, the sound was horribly final. Miriam froze, her eyes wide. She knew, they both knew, what that sound was. Eli gently set Sarah down, though the child remained pressed against his leg, her face hidden. He moved to a crack in the barn wall and peered out. In the next flash of lightning, he saw it. The main beam of the house had snapped. The roof had caved in on itself, collapsing the entire structure into a heap of sodden, splintered timber. The place they had stood just moments before was now a ruin. Miriam let out a small, choked cry. She stumbled back against a support beam and slid down to sit on a pile of hay, the blanket clutched in her hands. She stared at the barn doors, at the darkness that had just swallowed her home, her past, everything she owned in the world. "It's gone," she whispered, the words barely audible. "The house, it's all gone." Sarah began to sob, the sound muffled against Eli's leg. He knelt, turning the child to face him. "It's all right," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble amidst the storm's fury. "You're safe now. We're all safe." He looked over at Miriam, at her hunched form, the picture of utter desolation. He knew they needed warmth, a focal point to push back the cold and the dark. He found a dry spot in the center of the earthen floor, away from the drafts. Using his knife, he shaved kindling from a dry log stored in the corner and, with practiced hands, coaxed a small, sputtering flame to life using the oil lamp. He built it up slowly, carefully, adding larger pieces of wood until a small, steady fire crackled between them, pushing the oppressive darkness back into the corners. The warmth began to seep into their chilled bodies. He sat on an overturned bucket. Sarah huddled between his knees, wrapped in his still damp duster. Miriam hadn't moved. She was still staring into the fire, but her eyes were seeing the wreckage of her life. Her shoulders shook with silent, repressed sobs. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the muffled roar of the storm outside. Eli watched her, his heart aching with a feeling he couldn't name. It was more than pity. It was a profound sense of connection to this woman's pain, a resonance with the grief and loss that had shaped his own life. He had come into her world to plant a few seeds, and now he was a witness to its complete destruction. Finally, Miriam spoke, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I have nothing, less than nothing now." Eli let the silence sit for a moment before he answered, choosing his words with care. "A house is just wood and nails. Miriam, it can be rebuilt." He looked from her to the child huddled against him. "Some things are worth rebuilding. You and that little girl are two of them." His words, simple and direct, hung in the warm air between them. They were not words of pity, but of profound, unvarnished respect. It was a declaration of her value, of her daughter's value, in a world that had told her she had none. She finally lifted her head, and her tear-filled eyes met his across the dancing flames. In that moment, something shifted. The barriers of suspicion and pride, of grief and loneliness, seemed to dissolve in the flickering firelight. It wasn't a moment of passion, but something deeper, more elemental. It was the silent recognition of two shipwrecked souls finding a shared shore in the midst of a raging sea. He saw not just a widow, but a woman of incredible, battered strength. And she, for the first time, saw in his weathered face not a stranger or a threat, but a steady, quiet harbor. He saw her shiver, a tremor that ran through her entire body. He stood, took the quilt from where it had fallen beside her, and gently draped it around her shoulders. His hand brushed her arm, and the brief contact was like a spark, a current of shared humanity that passed between them. Her breath hitched, and she pulled the quilt tighter, not moving away from his touch. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered. The sound of his first name on her lips felt both strange and natural. He gave a slow nod and returned to his seat by the fire. Sarah had finally cried herself to sleep. Her small body slumped against his leg, her breathing soft and even. Eli gently shifted her, laying her down on a bed of clean hay near the fire and covering her with the driest part of his duster. He and Miriam sat in a comfortable silence, watching the flames. The storm outside began to lose its fury, its roars diminishing to a distant, angry rumble. The relentless drumming of rain on the roof softened to a steady, almost peaceful patter. They were safe, they were together, and in the shared warmth of the small barn, surrounded by the ruins of one life. The first, fragile foundations of another were being laid. As the gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the barn walls, the rain finally stopped. A profound stillness settled over the land, broken only by the dripping of water from the eaves. The world outside was washed clean, reborn. Eli rose and opened the heavy barn doors. The air that flowed in was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage, the scent of life renewed. The ground was a sea of mud, but the sky was a clear, pale blue. The rising sun caught the lingering water droplets on the broken fence posts, making them sparkle like diamonds. The newly planted garden was soaked, the precious seeds now buried in dark, life-giving mud. Miriam came to stand beside him. Together, they looked at the flattened pile of timber and debris that had been her home. The sight was devastating. Yet, in the clean morning light, It looked less like an ending and more like a space that had been cleared, waiting for something new. They had lost a house, but huddled together in the dark, listening to the tempest of their own hearts. They had found something far more important, a reason to rebuild. Part 4. Of Nails and Prejudice. The dawn that broke after the storm was a fragile promise. The world was washed in a clean, sharp light, but the devastation remained. The house was a skeleton, a jumble of broken ribs and splintered bones lying in a sea of red mud. For another woman, it might have been the final, crushing blow. But as Eli watched Miriam that morning, he saw not despair, but a quiet, fierce resolve hardening in her green eye. The storm had taken everything she had, and in doing so, had stripped away the last of her fear. There was no discussion, no formal agreement. It was simply understood. He would stay. He had to. He spent the morning riding the perimeter of his own land, checking on his few cattle, and securing his cabin. He packed a bag with what he'd need as tools, a change of clothes, and a side of salted bacon. When he returned to the Harper place in the afternoon, Miriam had already begun the impossible task of salvage. She was pulling salvageable timbers from the wreckage, her dress and hands caked in mud, her movements methodical and tireless. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Eli, with his brute strength and knowledge of carpentry, took the lead, assessing the damage and directing the work. He taught Miriam how to pry boards loose without splitting them, how to test a beam for integrity, and how to sort the usable lumber from the firewood. He was a man of few words, and his instructions were concise and practical. Hold this steady. Pry from the bottom. Watch your hands. Miriam was his echo, his shadow, her determination a match for his strength. She worked without complaint, her slim frame belying a wiry toughness he came to admire. She learned quickly, her hands, once soft, becoming calloused and capable. They worked under the hot sun. The silence between them filled with the sounds of their labor, the grating scrape of wood being dragged through mud, the sharp ring of his hammer against a stubborn nail, their shared, rhythmic breathing. And through it all, there was Sarah. For the first day, she remained a solemn little ghost, watching them from the relative safety of the barn entrance, her corn-husk doll her only companion. But as the skeleton of a new frame began to rise from the ruins of the old, a change began in her. On the third day, as Eli was showing Miriam how to notch a new support beam, a small, yellow butterfly, drawn by the newly watered wildflowers, began to dance in the air. Sarah, forgetting her fear, took a hesitant step, then another, and began to chase it. Her chase was clumsy in the mud, and she slipped, landing softly in a patch of wet earth. For a moment, she looked startled. Then, a small giggle escaped her lips. The sound, clear and bright as a silver bell, made both Eli and Miriam freeze. They turned to look at her. Sarah, seeing their eyes on her, giggled again, a full, uninhibited peal of childish delight. It was the first time Eli had heard her make a sound other than a cry or a whisper. A slow smile spread across Miriam's face, a genuine, unguarded expression of joy that transformed her tired features and made Eli's chest feel tight. In that moment, surrounded by wreckage, the sound of that child's laughter felt more solid and real than any wall they could build. It was the sound of life, stubbornly, beautifully, refusing to be extinguished. From then on, Sarah became a part of their work site, her small presence a constant source of quiet joy. She would bring them cups of water from the well, her small face a mask of concentration as she tried not to spill a drop. She would collect bent nails in a can for Eli to straighten later, and her laughter became a more frequent music, a counterpoint to the thud of the hammer. But while they were building a new life in their isolated world of mud and timber, the old world was stirring. A week after the storm, the first tendrils of gossip reached them, carried on the wind from Dry Creek. Eli had ridden into town for supplies, more nails, rope, and a sack of coffee. The chill he felt in Croft's general store had nothing to do with the weather. Conversation stopped when he entered. Men who had once nodded to him now stared at their boots. Silas Croft served him in a clipped, hostile silence. Eli ignored it all, paid for his goods, and left. He knew what they were thinking. He was a solitary man, and solitude was respectable, but a man living on a widow's land. A widow with a dark reputation that was something else entirely. That was a scandal. The confrontation he knew was coming arrived 2 days later. He saw the dust cloud first, rising from the direction of town. 2 riders, moving at a deliberate pace. As they grew closer, he recognized them, Sheriff Jed Watson, a man whose authority came more from his badge than his backbone. And beside him, Tom Garrett, a prosperous rancher whose piety was as vast as his land holdings and as shallow as a dry creek bed. Garrett was the unofficial arbiter of Dry Creek's morality, a man who saw sin in every shadow. Eli set down his hammer and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Miriam, who was helping him lift a wall frame into place, saw them too. The light went out of her face, replaced by the old, familiar wariness. She instinctively called for Sarah, who ran to her mother's side and clung to her skirt. Eli stepped forward, away from the house, meeting them in the open yard. He stood with his feet planted, his hands loose at his sides, a silent, immovable object. The 2 men reined in their horses. Sheriff Watson had the decency to look uncomfortable. Tom Garrett's face was a mask of stern disapproval. "Rollins," the sheriff began, avoiding Eli's direct gaze. "Afternoon." "Sheriff Garrett," Eli acknowledged, his voice flat. We were just riding out this way," Watson stammered. "Folks in town. They're concerned. They say you've been out here since the storm." "That a crime now, Sheriff?" Eli asked, his tone dangerously quiet. It was Garrett who answered, his voice dripping with condescension. "It ain't proper. Rollins, and you know it. A man of your age, living out here with her." He flicked a dismissive glance toward Miriam, as if her presence was an offense. "It's a disgrace to your late wife's memory." The mention of Martha was a deliberate cruelty, a knife twisted in an old wound, a muscle clenched in Eli's jaw. "Leave my wife out of this, Garrett. I'm helping a widow whose house was destroyed. It's what neighbors do." "She ain't a neighbor to be helped," Garrett sneered. "She's a blight on this community. We all know what happened to Jeb Harper, and now you're here, giving credence to her. Wickedness. It reflects poorly on us all." "The only thing that reflects poorly here," Eli said, his voice dropping to a low growl, "is a town that would leave a woman and her child to fend for themselves in a ruin." "That's enough," Sheriff Watson said, finally finding a sliver of authority. "Eli, this is a warning. This situation. It's inflaming passions, for your own good, and for the peace of the community. You should pack up and go back to your own place. Let her handle her own affairs." Before Eli could respond, a clear, steady voice cut through the tense air. "He's not going anywhere." Miriam stepped forward, leaving Sarah by the foundation of the new house. She walked until she stood beside Eli, but she wasn't hiding behind him. She faced the 2 men on horseback directly, her back straight, her chin high. The timid, shamed woman from the general store was gone. In her place stood someone forged in storm and hardship. She looked directly at Sheriff Watson, her green eyes blazing with a cold fire. "You are the law in this town. Sheriff, is it your duty to enforce gossip or to protect citizens?" Watson shifted in his saddle. "Now, Miriam, it's a matter of decency." "Decency," she interrupted, her voice ringing with scorn. "Is it decent to let a child sleep in a barn because her home is gone? Is it decent to watch a woman break her back trying to rebuild a life while you sit in judgment? This man," she gestured toward Eli, "has shown me more decency and Christian charity in 1 week than I have seen from this entire town in a year." She then turned her gaze on Tom Garrett, and it was as sharp and cutting as glass. "You speak of my husband. You know nothing. You only know the whispers you and your kind like to spread because it makes you feel righteous. You dare to stand there and judge us." She took another step forward. "If helping a widow and her child brings shame upon you, then that shame is yours. Mr. Garrett, not mine. Take it back to town with you. It has no place here." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Garrett's face was purple with rage and humiliation, but he had no answer. Sheriff Watson stared down at his saddle horn, thoroughly defeated. Miriam had not raised her voice, but her words had the force of a physical blow, striking at the very core of their hypocrisy. Finally, the sheriff gathered his reins. "We've said our piece," he mumbled. He threw a final, conflicted look at Eli. "Don't say you weren't warned. Rollins." He turned his horse and rode away. Garrett lingered for a moment, his eyes filled with venom, and shot a look at Miriam that was a pure, undiluted threat. Then he too wheeled his horse around and galloped after the sheriff, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Eli watched them go, the tension slowly draining out of him, replaced by a feeling he hadn't known in years. He turned to Miriam. She was trembling slightly, the aftermath of her courage, but her eyes were dry and defiant. He saw the immense cost of her stand and the incredible strength it had taken. He had spent the last 5 years of his life building a wall around himself, protecting his solitude, avoiding entanglement. His honor, his reputation, was a quiet, private thing. He had never considered it something to be risked, let alone sacrificed. But as he looked at Miriam, standing proud and fierce amidst the bones of her new home, and at her daughter, watching them with wide, trusting eyes, he felt a profound shift within him. The town had drawn a line in the dust. They had made him choose, and in that moment, he realized the choice had already been made. He was no longer just helping a neighbor. He was defending a family, his peace, his reputation, the quiet, solitary life he had so carefully guarded. None of it mattered as much as the safety of the woman and child standing before him. For the first time since Martha's death, he had something to protect that was more important than his own grief, and he would stand against the whole damn town to do it. Part 5. Where Blood Falls on Red Earth. The confrontation with Watson and Garrett left a toxic residue in the air, a poison that seeped into the very soil they worked. A tense, unspoken understanding settled over their small, isolated world. They had crossed a line. The town of Dry Creek was no longer a place of passive judgment. It was an active threat. For 2 weeks, they lived like islanders, their work on the house their only reality. The walls were up, and the roof beams, stark against the blue sky, looked like the bleached ribs of a great beast. They were building a home, but they were also building a fortress, their self-imposed exile. However, could not last. The land was a hard mistress. A vital hinge on the barn door rusted through and snapped, and the small supply of salted meat they'd been living on was gone. Survival demanded a trip into the lion's den. Eli tried to argue that he should go alone, but Miriam, her jaw set with a new, unyielding strength, refused. "We are in this together, Eli," she had said, her voice quiet but firm. "We will not hide." So they rode into Dry Creek together, Sarah seated in front of Miriam on her old mare, Ajax striding steadily alongside. Eli's hand never strayed far from the Colt holstered on his hip. He felt the weight of every stare as they moved down the main street. Doors closed, faces turned away. The silence was louder and more hostile than any shouted insult. They were lepers, pariahs in their own land. They conducted their business with grim efficiency at the general store, enduring Silas Croft's resentful silence. It was on their way out, as they were loading their meager supplies onto the horses, that the trouble they had been expecting found them. It began with a voice, slurred with whiskey and malice, from the shadows of the alleyway between the store and the saloon. "Well, looky here, it's the happy family." Eli turned slowly. 3 men detached themselves from the darkness. He recognized them as ranch hands from Tom Garrett's spread, men with more muscle than sense. Their loyalty bought with wages and whiskey. Their leader, a burly man named Caleb with a flattened nose and mean, piggy eyes, swaggered forward, a half-empty bottle dangling from his hand. "That's far enough," Eli said, his voice a low warning. He moved slightly, placing himself between the men and Miriam, who was quickly lifting Sarah onto her horse. Caleb laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Getting mighty protective of the Black Widow, ain't you? Rollins, does she whisper sweet nothings in your ear, or just tell you how much foxglove to put in a man's coffee?" The other 2 snickered, fanning out to cut off any retreat. "Get on your horse, Miriam," Eli said without turning around, his eyes locked on Caleb. "Ride out, now." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "Go," he commanded, a raw authority in his voice she had never heard before. "Keep the child safe. That's an order." He heard the hesitation, then the sound of her scrambling into the saddle. He heard the frantic hoofbeats as she spurred the mare into a gallop. Heading out of town, it was the only thing that mattered. Now he was alone. 3 to 1. The odds were poor, but they had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they were cornering a tired old homesteader. They had forgotten that Eli Rollins had survived cattle drives, border skirmishes, and the general, brutal chaos of the West. His quietness was not weakness. "You boys have made a mistake," Eli said, his voice soft. Caleb took another swig from his bottle and tossed it aside, where it shattered against the wall. "The only mistake was you messin' with town business. Mr. Garrett, he don't like folks who shelter poisoners." He lunged. Eli didn't reach for his gun. A shooting in the middle of town, even in self-defense, would be a hanging offense. He met Caleb's clumsy charge with a lifetime of hard-earned economy. He sidestepped, bringing the heel of his boot down hard on Caleb's ankle. The man howled as his joint buckled, and Eli followed through with a hard, driving fist to the side of his head that sent him sprawling into the dust. The other 2, momentarily stunned, charged together. This was not a brawl. It was an exercise in survival. Eli fought with a cold, desperate fury. He blocked a punch from one, taking the blow on his forearm, and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. He heard a satisfying crack, but as he turned, the 3rd man swung a heavy piece of wood he'd picked up from the alley, catching Eli across the back of his legs. His knees buckled, and a searing pain shot up his spine. He went down to one knee before he could recover. They were on him. It was no longer a fight. It was a beating. A boot caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs in a painful gasp. A fist connected with his jaw, and the world exploded in a flash of white light. He tasted the coppery tang of blood. He curled into a ball, protecting his head and stomach as best he could, enduring the rain of kicks and blows. Through the red haze of pain, he was dimly aware of shouting, of the saloon doors swinging open, of more men spilling out not to help, but to watch the sport. He didn't know how long it lasted. It felt like an eternity. He was drowning, his lungs burning, his body a symphony of agony. Then, just as his consciousness began to fray at the edges, he heard a voice cut through the haze. "That's enough! Get off him!" It was Sheriff Watson. The kick stopped. Eli lay in the dirt, gasping for breath, every inch of his body screaming in protest. He pushed himself up, his arms shaking with the effort. He saw the sheriff holding the men back, his face a mixture of fear and frustration. Tom Garrett stood on the saloon boardwalk, watching the scene with a cold, satisfied smile. "Get out of my town, Rollins," Watson said, his voice strained. "I warned you. I can't protect you if you keep this up." Eli staggered to his feet, swaying. His face was a mask of blood and dust. One eye was swelling shut, his ribs felt like they were on fire. He spat a mouthful of bloody saliva into the dirt at Watson's feet. He didn't say a word. He gave one long, hard look at Garrett, a look that promised a future reckoning, then turned and limped toward where Ajax was still patiently tied. Every step was an agony. Pulling himself into the saddle was a monumental effort that left him dizzy and nauseous. As he rode out of town, he could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on his back, a weight of judgment heavier than any physical blow. The ride home was a blur of pain. He clung to the saddle horn, his vision tunneling, the rhythm of Ajax's walk sending jolts of fire through his body. He wasn't sure he was going to make it. The only thing that kept him conscious was a single, repeating thought: Miriam. Sarah, get back to them. He must have passed out, because the next thing he knew, he was being gently pulled from the saddle, Miriam's arms around him, her face a pale oval of terror in the deepening dusk. Eli, oh God, Eli. He collapsed against her, and together they stumbled into the half-finished house, which was now lit by the warm, steady glow of a single lantern. She eased him onto the cot they had salvaged, his body screaming in protest at every movement. Sarah stood in the corner, her small face ashen, her eyes wide with a silent, horrified understanding. The next hour was a hellish intimacy, with trembling hands. Miriam gently cleaned the cuts and bruises on his face and torso with a cloth dipped in precious well water. His shirt was soaked with blood from a deep gash above his eyebrow. His ribs were a mass of angry purple and black bruises. He gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out, but involuntary groans escaped his lips. The worst was the gash on his forehead. It was deep, still weeping blood, and would need to be closed. Miriam looked at it, her own fear warring with her resolve. She sterilized a sewing needle and thread in the lantern's flame, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold them steady. I have to do this, Eli, she whispered, her voice choked with tears. I'm so sorry. He reached up and caught her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. It's not your fault, he rasped. None of this is... As she leaned over him, her brow furrowed in concentration, her tears began to fall, splashing onto his bruised cheek. The first stitch was an agony. He flinched, a sharp hiss of breath escaping his teeth, but he held perfectly still for her. She worked with a desperate focus, her small, trembling hands performing the grim task with a love that was more potent than any medicine. When she was finished, she slumped back, utterly spent. She looked at him, at the ruin the town had made of him, and a wave of guilt and despair washed over her. Why, Eli, she finally whispered, the question torn from the deepest part of her soul. Why risk everything, your safety, your reputation for me? He lay there, battered and broken, his one good eye fixed on her face. The pain was a roaring fire in his body, but in that moment, looking at her, it seemed to fade to a dull ember. He saw not the town pariah, the black widow, but the woman who had laughed at a butterfly, who had fought for her dignity with words of fire, who was now tending his wounds with hands that shook with love. He lifted his hand, his fingers gently brushing the tear tracks on her cheek. His voice was a raw, painful whisper, but his words were clearer and more certain than any he had ever spoken. Because when I look at you, he said, his gaze holding hers captive, I see more than trouble. I see a woman worth every risk. The dam of her control finally broke. A sob, raw and ragged, tore from her throat, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her weeping. It was the sound of a heart breaking and healing all at once. For a year, she had been a ghost, surviving on scraps of pride. She had forgotten what it felt for someone to see her, truly see her, as something precious. She cried for the cruelty of the town, for the pain he had endured on her behalf, and for the terrifying, beautiful flicker of hope he had just ignited in the darkest corner of her soul. She cried because she did not know how to believe in happiness anymore. The next day, as Eli lay stiff and aching on the cot, another rider approached. It was Sheriff Watson, Alone this time. He dismounted, holding a piece of paper in his hand. Miriam met him at the door, barring his way. "He's in no condition for visitors. Sheriff," she said, her voice cold. "This is official business," Watson said, refusing to meet her eye. He looked past her at Eli. "Rollins, I'm sorry about what happened, but this has gone too far. Tom Garrett has filed a formal complaint with the circuit judge. He claims your association with Mrs. Harper is a public nuisance and a moral blight. He's petitioning the court to have your land claim declared forfeit on grounds of moral turpitude." The words fell like stones into the quiet room. Eli slowly, painfully pushed himself into a sitting position. His land, the one thing he had left, the soil he and Martha had worked, the place where she was buried, it was everything. "He can't do that," Eli said, his voice weak but laced with disbelief. "He can try," Watson replied, a note of genuine regret in his voice. "And with the way folks feel right now, he might just succeed. I'm telling you this as a warning. The only way to stop this is to leave this place. Go back to your ranch. Alone. Show the judge that you've cut ties. It's the only way you'll keep your land." He placed the official notice on a nearby crate and turned to leave. "The judge will be here in a month," he said over his shoulder. "You have until then to make your choice." Part 6. The Choice in the Silence. The sheriff's legal notice was a quiet poison. It lay on the crate where he'd left it. A stark white rectangle in the rustic dimness of the half-finished cabin. It was more menacing than any bruise, more chilling than any threat shouted in a dusty street. A fist can break a bone, but a piece of paper, backed by the law and the venom of a town, could unmake a man's entire life. In the days that followed, a new kind of silence settled between Eli and Miriam. It was not the comfortable silence of shared labor, but a heavy, brittle quiet, filled with the things they could not bring themselves to say. Eli's body began to heal. The swelling around his eye went down, turning a ghastly shade of yellow and green. The stitches in his forehead were a tight, angry line. But the pain in his ribs was a constant, sharp reminder of his vulnerability, and of the choice that now lay before him. He would sit for long stretches on the porch of the new structure, staring north, in the direction of his own ranch, his land. The word was more than just a claim. It was his history. He could picture every dip and rise of the terrain, every stubborn patch of mesquite. He knew where the hawks nested and where the coyotes made their dens, and beneath the lone, gnarled oak tree on the highest ridge, Martha was buried. He had carved her name into a stone himself. That land was his anchor, his final connection to the woman he had loved, the last remnant of a life that made sense. Garrett's legal petition wasn't just an attack on his property. It was an attempt to sever his roots, to erase his past. Miriam watched him. She saw the distant, haunted look in his eyes and knew where his thoughts were. The weight of her guilt was a physical thing, a stone in her chest. This man had shown her a kindness she thought had vanished from the world, and in return, she had brought ruin to his doorstep. He had risked his body for her. Now he was being asked to risk his soul. One evening, as the crickets began their nightly chorus, she finally broke the silence. She sat on the step below him, not looking at him, her hands twisting a loose thread on her apron. "You should go, Eli," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Go back to your ranch. We will be all right." He turned his head slowly, the movement pulling at the stitches on his forehead. "All right, Miriam, you saw what they did." "And I see what they are doing to you," she countered, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "This is your home, your land. Your wife is buried there. You cannot lose that. Not for me. I won't let you." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I am used to being alone. I survived before. I will survive again. But you can't let them take that from you. It's too much to ask." He looked at her, at the fierce, self-sacrificing pride on her face. She was willing to send him away, to return to her world of fear and isolation, just to save him. The thought of her facing the town's hatred alone, of Sarah growing up in that poison, was more painful than any blow he had taken. "I ain't going anywhere," he said, his voice a low, final rumble. And that was the end of the discussion. But the town was not finished with them. The hatred that had been simmering now reached its boiling point. The attack, when it came, was under the cover of a moonless night. 3 days after the sheriff's visit, Eli had been sleeping fitfully on his cot, the pain in his ribs making deep rest impossible. Miriam and Sarah were asleep in the barn, which was more secure and warmer than the open-walled house. The first sound was a dull thud against the new pine wall, followed by a low murmur of voices from the darkness. Eli was awake instantly, his senses on high alert. He swung his legs off the cot, his body screaming in protest, and reached for the Colt that he now kept within arm's reach. Another thud, this one harder. Then a rock came sailing through an open window frame, crashing against the far wall. "Witch!" a drunken voice roared from the darkness. "Get out of our town! And take your renegade lover with you," another voice added, followed by a chorus of ugly laughter. Eli moved silently to the edge of the doorway, peering into the oppressive dark. He could make out a handful of shapes, maybe 5 or 6 men, a cowardly mob emboldened by whiskey and the anonymity of the night. They were fanned out, keeping their distance, hurling insults and stones. A rock shattered the glass of the one salvaged window pane they had painstakingly installed. The sound sent a jolt through Eli. It was more than just vandalism. It was a violation, a deliberate act of destruction aimed at the heart of their fragile hope. He heard a frightened cry from the barn. "Sarah!" A cold, clarifying rage settled over him. It burned away the pain, the indecision, the fear for his land. There was only this moment, this threat, and the 2 lives he had sworn to protect. He raised the Colt Peacemaker, the metal cool and solid in his hand. He didn't aim at any of the men. He aimed high, at the black, empty sky. He squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the night stillness. A tongue of orange flame leaped from the barrel, and the gunshot echoed across the plains. A single, unambiguous statement of authority. The shouting stopped instantly. The mob, so brave in the darkness, was silenced by the sudden, lethal sound. For a long moment, there was only the ringing in Eli's ears. Then he heard the frantic scramble of men running, stumbling over each other in their haste to disappear back into the night from which they had crawled. He stood there for a long time, the gun still held ready, listening until the last sounds of their retreat had faded, replaced once again by the chirping of the crickets. The immediate danger was over, but the truth of their situation had been laid bare. This would not stop. The town would not rest until it had driven them out or destroyed them. They were living on borrowed time. The barn door creaked open, and Miriam appeared, a lantern held high in her shaking hand. Her face was as white as a sheet. Sarah was clinging to her, her small body racked with silent sobs. "Are they gone?" Miriam whispered. "For now," Eli said, lowering the gun. He looked from her terrified face to the crying child, and the choice that had been torturing him for days was no longer a choice at all. It was a simple, brutal necessity. There was no life for them here, not anymore. He walked over to her, his limp more pronounced from his sudden movements. He stopped in front of her, his expression grim and resolute in the lantern light. "Miriam," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Go inside. Pack whatever you can carry, your clothes, the blanket, any food we have. We're leaving." She stared at him, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning understanding. Leaving where?" "My ranch," he said. "It's isolated. It's defensible. Garrett's men won't follow us there. Not yet. Anyway, we can't stay here. It's not safe. Not for you, and not for her." The full weight of his decision settled on her. He was choosing them. He was choosing to walk away from the fight for his land, choosing to risk everything he owned, to take them to the one place that was his sanctuary. "Eli, your land," she began, her voice cracking. "The warning. The judge." "The judge can have the damn land," he said, his voice harsh with a pain she could only guess at. "It's just dirt and memories. It's not worth her life." He looked down at Sarah, who was peering up at him, her tear-streaked face full of a child's absolute terror. "It's not worth yours." Sarah, sensing the shift, let go of her mother's dress. She took a step forward and wrapped her small arms around Eli's leg, clinging to him with all her might. She looked up at her mother, her small voice trembling but clear. "Please, Mama," she pleaded, her words a perfect, heartbreaking echo of all their fears. "Please, let's go where the bad men can't find us." The child's plea shattered the last of Miriam's resistance. This was no longer about Eli's sacrifice or her pride. It was about her daughter's safety. It was about finding a place where a little girl didn't have to live in fear of rocks thrown in the night. She nodded. A single, slow movement. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Their departure was a quiet, hurried affair. They had little to pack. Their worldly possessions fit into 2 cloth bundles. Eli saddled the horses while Miriam gathered their things, her movements swift and efficient. She wrapped Sarah in the warmest quilt and handed her up to Eli, who settled the child in front of him on Ajax's saddle. Before mounting her own horse, Miriam paused. She turned and took one last look at the place that had been her home. She saw the original, ruined shack, a dark heap of memories and pain. And beside it, she saw the new structure, its pale, unfinished walls glowing in the lantern light. It stood as a monument to a hope that had been born and was now being abandoned. It was the place where she had heard her daughter laugh for the first time in a year, the place where a quiet, battered man had told her she was worth the risk. It was the home they had started to build together, a dream that now had to be left behind in the dirt. A single tear finally escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She took a deep breath, turned her back on the ghosts and the dreams, and pulled herself into the saddle. Without a word, Eli nudged Ajax forward, and they rode out into the darkness. Heading north, they left the flickering lantern burning on the porch, a lone point of light in a vast, hostile darkness, until it was finally swallowed by the distance, leaving only the dust and the silence behind. Part 7. A new house, a different start. The ride to Eli's ranch was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. They moved through the pre-dawn chill, 3 silent figures against a sky slowly turning from inky black to a bruised purple. Sarah, wrapped in a quilt and nestled securely against Eli's chest, had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. Miriam rode beside him, her face a pale, determined mask, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon ahead. She had left her entire world behind, a world of pain and judgment, and was riding toward an unknown that was both terrifying and, in a strange, hollow way, liberating. As the first rays of the sun crested the eastern hills, painting the plains in strokes of gold and rose, they arrived. Eli's ranch was not a grand place, but it was a world away from the desperate, crumbling homestead Miriam had just fled. The land, while still part of the same parched country, felt different here. It felt anchored. The fences were made of thick, weathered cedar posts, strung with taut wire, a testament to years of diligent maintenance. The fields were fallow from the drought, but they were clear of the choking weeds and debris that had littered her own property. This was a place that had been cared for. The heart of the ranch was a sturdy, square-built log cabin, its timbers silvered with age, a thin curl of smoke already rising from its stone chimney from a fire Eli had banked before leaving. A well-built barn stood nearby, larger and in better repair than her own had ever been. And most importantly, there was the well. It was capped with a heavy wooden lid and a solid, smooth-working crank. It was a well built to last, sunk deep into the earth to tap the hidden springs that the surface world had forgotten. It was a promise of life. Eli reined Ajax to a halt in the yard. The stillness was profound, broken only by the soft nicker of his horse and the distant cry of a hawk. He dismounted carefully, lifting the sleeping Sarah into his arms. He stood for a moment, looking at the cabin, his home, now seen through new eyes. For 5 years, it had been a shell, a place of solitude and memory. Now, it was about to become a sanctuary.
"This is it,"
he said, his voice low and rough. Miriam slid from her horse, her legs stiff from the long ride. She looked at the cabin, then at the sturdy barn, her gaze lingering on the well. She saw not just buildings, but the embodiment of a life's work. This was what a man's strength and foresight could build. It was solid. It was safe. The contrast with her own fragile existence was so stark it made her ache. "It's quiet," she said, the word encompassing everything. "It is," Eli agreed. He carried Sarah toward the cabin. "Let's get you both inside." The interior was Spartan and impeccably clean. A simple cot stood in one corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs in the center. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. The shelves held a few tin plates, a handful of books, and a small, faded photograph in a wooden frame of a smiling, dark-haired woman, Martha. Miriam felt a pang of something she couldn't name, not jealousy, but a profound respect, and the uncomfortable feeling of being an intruder in a sacred space. Eli laid Sarah gently on his own cot, pulling a thick wool blanket over her. The child murmured in her sleep but didn't wake. He then turned to Miriam. The small cabin felt crowded with their presence, charged with the unspoken questions that hung between them. "You can take the cot," he said, gesturing toward the bed. "I'll sleep in the barn, at least until we can figure things out." The delicacy of his words, his immediate effort to preserve her honor even after all that had happened, touched her deeply. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered. The days that followed fell into a new, quiet rhythm. There was no talk of the town, of the legal notice, of the future. The present was all-consuming, a series of simple, grounding tasks that healed them in ways words could not. They were not building a house from scratch, but rather, they were weaving their lives into the fabric of a place that was already whole. Eli showed her the routines of the ranch. He taught her how to draw water from the deep well without tiring, how to mend a broken fence post so it would stand against the wind, how to read the sky for signs of weather. He was a patient teacher, his hands guiding hers, his words sparse but clear. In return, Miriam brought a new life to the cabin. For 5 years, it had been a place for sleeping and eating. She transformed it into a home. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards gleamed. She found a stash of Martha's old linens, washed them in the precious well water, and patched them with neat, tiny stitches. The smell of baking bread, made from the flour he had bought for her, soon filled the small space, a scent of domesticity that had been absent for far too long. Sarah, freed from the oppressive fear of Dry Creek, blossomed. The ranch became her kingdom. The sturdy fences were not a prison, but a boundary that defined her world and made it safe. She followed Eli like a shadow as he did his chores, chattering away, asking 1,000 questions that he answered with a surprising, gentle patience. She made friends with the chickens, giving them all names, and spent hours watching a litter of barn cats tumble in the hay. The haunted, solemn look in her eyes was replaced by a bright, childish curiosity. Her laughter, which had been so rare and precious, now became a common sound, a music that filled the quiet air. They worked together, side by side, in a comfortable, productive silence, They built a new, secure coop for the chickens. They cleared a patch of ground near the cabin for a new garden, the soil here richer and more forgiving. As they worked, turning the earth and pulling stones, they began to share pieces of their past. He told her stories of cattle drives, of long nights under the stars. She, in turn, spoke of her childhood back east, of a life before she came to this hard, unforgiving land. She never spoke of her husband. Jeb and Eli never asked. Some ghosts were best left undisturbed. One afternoon, Miriam found a small, intricately carved wooden bird tucked away on a high shelf. It was smooth and worn, clearly shaped by a loving hand. "Martha made that," Eli said quietly, coming to stand behind her. "She had a gift for such things." Miriam ran her thumb over the smooth wood. "She must have been a wonderful woman." "She was," Eli said, his voice thick with memory. "She was the best of me." Instead of creating a barrier, the ghost of Martha became a gentle, benevolent presence. Miriam felt she was not replacing her, but perhaps continuing her work of making this small corner of the world a place of warmth and life. Their love, if it could be called that yet, was not a thing of grand pronouncements or fiery passion. It was a slow, quiet construction, built piece by piece, like the stone wall they began to erect around the new garden. It was in the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh water for her on the porch every morning. It was in the way she mended a tear in his shirt without him having to ask. It was in the shared glance across the dinner table when Sarah said something funny. It was a love built of trust, of resilience, of the profound, unspoken gratitude of two people who had found a safe harbor in each other. It was companionship forged in the crucible of shared suffering. A month passed. The new garden was planted. The wall around it was waist-high. The jagged edges of their trauma were beginning to soften. The threat of the town and Garrett's legal claim still loomed, a dark cloud on a distant horizon. But here, within the boundaries of the ranch, they had created a fragile peace. One night, after Sarah was sound asleep on the cot, they sat outside by a small, crackling fire. The stars in the vast, black sky were so close and bright they seemed to be within arm's reach. The air was cool and clean. For a long time, neither of them spoke, content to listen to the fire and the immense silence of the plains. Miriam looked at Eli's profile, silhouetted against the flames. His face was still bruised, and the new scar on his forehead was a pale line in the firelight. He was not a handsome man in the way of city folk, but his face had a deep, quiet strength that she had come to rely on more than she relied on the rising of the sun. He had given up everything for her, and she still didn't fully understand why. She needed to— "What are we doing, Eli?" she asked, her voice soft, almost blending with the crackle of the flames. He didn't answer right away. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending a shower of orange sparks up into the darkness. He seemed to be weighing his words, searching for the simple, honest truth. The question was about more than just their daily chores, and they both knew it. It was about the future. It was about what they were to each other. Finally, he looked at her, his gaze direct and steady in the flickering light. His faded denim eyes held no pity, only a deep, unwavering sincerity. "We're building something new," he said, his voice a low, certain rumble. He paused, and in that small space of silence, the whole of his risk, his sacrifice, and his hope seemed to hang in the balance. "If you'll let me." The words were an offer, not a demand. It was a question, not a statement. He was giving her the choice, the power, the agency that had been stripped from her for so long. He was not assuming her heart or her future. He was asking for permission to help her build one. Miriam felt the tightness in her chest, the knot of fear and uncertainty she had carried for years, finally begin to dissolve. She didn't have a grand speech in return. All the pain, all the gratitude, all the fragile, budding hope in her heart coalesced into a single, shimmering tear that welled in her eye. and traced a slow path down her cheek, glowing like a falling star in the firelight. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. The question was answered. The foundation was laid. Here, in the vast, lonely heart of the West, under a blanket of stars, two broken souls had finally found the plans for a new beginning. Part 8. Dawn on Dry Creek. A year is a lifetime in the West. It is enough time for the earth to forget its thirst, for a wound to become a scar, and for the fragile roots of a new life to take hold in hostile soil. 1 year after their flight into the moonless night, the world at Eli Rollins' ranch was transformed. The great drought had broken that winter in a series of long, gentle soaks, and the land, with the tireless optimism of nature, had responded. The creek, which had been a dry, dusty memory for so long, now ran with a quiet, steady chuckle. The grass on the plains was no longer a scorched brown, but a sea of pale green, rippling in the wind. But the most profound change was in the field that stretched out before the cabin. It was a field of barley, the very grain that had started it all. Now, under the golden light of an early autumn morning, the stalk stood tall and heavy-headed, a shimmering expanse of pure, life-giving gold. It was a testament to a year of back-breaking labor, of shared hope, and of the land's own forgiveness. 3 figures stood at the edge of that field, bathed in the soft morning light. Eli Rollins was no longer the gaunt, solitary man who had ridden into Dry Creek for a few sacks of grain. The deep lines of grief and loneliness were still etched on his face, but they had been softened by new lines. Lines of laughter that crinkled at the corners of his eyes. His shoulders, once perpetually hunched against the world, were now broad and relaxed. There was a quiet contentment in his posture, the look of a man who had found his place. Beside him, Miriam Harper stood not as a widow, but as a woman. The hunted look that had lived in her eyes for so long had vanished, replaced by a calm, steady light. Her hands, resting on the top rail of the fence, were calloused and strong, the hands of a partner who had helped build this life with her own sweat and determination. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, and the wind whipped a loose strand of dark hair across her cheek. She did not brush it away. She was at peace. And between them, darting in and out of the first rows of barley, was Sarah. The silent, solemn child was gone, and in her place was a girl of 7, her face glowing with health, her laughter carrying on the crisp morning air as she chased a grasshopper. She was no longer afraid of shadows, real or imagined. This ranch was her sanctuary, and its 2 quiet guardians were the center of her universe. The year had been one of healing, a slow, careful knitting together of 3 broken lives. They had expanded the cabin, adding a new room for Miriam and Sarah, the fresh-cut pine still smelling sweet and sharp. They had built the stone wall around their garden, and it now overflowed with pumpkins, squash, and beans. They had faced down a harsh winter, their small home a beacon of warmth against the howling winds. They had survived, and then they had begun to live. The news from the outside world came to them in trickles, carried by a traveling tinker who passed through twice a year. The legal challenge to Eli's land had simply evaporated. The tinker, a garrulous man named Silas, had explained it on his last visit. Tom Garrett, puffed up with his own self-importance after running Eli off, had turned his bullying tactics on the wrong man, a federal land surveyor mapping the territory. An argument over a boundary line had escalated, and Garrett, in a fit of pique, had assaulted the man. Assaulting a federal official was a different matter than beating a lone rancher in a dusty alley. The law, so slow and indifferent before, had finally arrived in Dry Creek with purpose. Garrett was arrested and taken to a federal court in a distant city, without its self-appointed moral guardian to stir the pot. The town's venom had lost its focus. The whispers about Miriam had faded, replaced by newer, More interesting scandals. The story of the witch and her protector became old news. And in the West, old news was as good as forgotten. They were free. The knowledge had settled upon them not with a bang, but with a quiet, profound sense of relief. The cloud that had hung over them had dissipated, leaving only the clear, blue Texas sky. Now, standing before the fruits of their labor, the past felt like a story that had happened to someone else. Sarah ran back to them from the field, her cheeks flushed, holding up a single, perfect stalk of barley. "Look, Eli," she said, her voice bright with discovery. "It's ready." Eli took the stalk from her, his large, rough hand surprisingly gentle. He rolled the grains between his thumb and forefinger. "That it is, little one," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "That it is. It's going to be a good harvest." Sarah beamed at his praise, then wrapped her arms around his waist in a spontaneous hug. Eli, who a year ago would have stood stiff and awkward at such a gesture, now naturally rested a hand on her head, his fingers stroking her dark hair. He was no longer just Eli. To this child, he was safety. He was home. Miriam watched them, her heart full of a quiet, overwhelming joy. She had thought happiness was a country she would never be allowed to enter again. Yet here it was, in this simple, unadorned moment, the warmth of the sun, the smell of the earth, the laughter of her child, and the steady presence of the man beside her. As Sarah ran off again, chasing another adventure among the golden stalks, Miriam moved closer to Eli, leaning her shoulder against his. They stood in a comfortable silence, their shared past and present a bond that needed no words. He smelled of pine, leather, and honest sweat. It was the scent of safety. He turned his head to look at her. The scar on his forehead was a faint, silvery line, a permanent reminder of the price he had paid. But in his eyes, she saw no regret, only a deep and abiding peace. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers, their hands, both scarred and strengthened by labor, fit together as if they were made for one another. "A year ago," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I was a ghost on this land, just waiting for my time to be up." "We were all ghosts, I think," she replied softly, her gaze on the shimmering field. He squeezed her hand gently, drawing her eyes back to his. He looked at her, then at Sarah, a small, vibrant figure in the vast golden sea. And then back to Miriam's face, all the pain, all the risk, all the uncertainty of the past year culminated in this single, perfect moment of clarity. "I came to town for grain," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "It was just a simple thing, something to keep my horse and me alive." He paused, his gaze full of a profound and humble wonder. "But I reckon I found something I never knew I needed." Miriam's heart swelled, and she could not speak. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder, her answer in the gesture. He had come for sustenance and had found a harvest for his soul, and she, who had been starving for kindness, had been given a feast. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its light glinting off the millions of individual grains of barley, each one a tiny, golden promise. Their love was like that field. It had not sprung up overnight in a blaze of passion. It had been planted in a time of drought, in the hard, unforgiving soil of grief and fear. It had been watered with shared sweat and quiet courage, and it had grown slowly, steadily, its roots digging deep to find life. It was not a fragile hothouse flower. It was a field of barley, golden and strong, ready for the harvest. It was a simple, enduring thing, and it was more than enough to save them both. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our journey, please consider subscribing to the channel, Wild West Night, and giving this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting that hype button. Your support means the world